Hey guys, welcome back to the quiet side of the internet. Tonight, we're unrolling a scroll that's been gathering dust for centuries, but trust me, what's inside is far from boring. Think less history class and more like stumbling onto a weird diary entry from 800 years ago, the kind with drama, weird rituals, and a surprising obsession with mangoes. You might be lying in bed right now, phone glowing in the dark, wrapped in a blanket like a sleepy time traveler. Maybe the night is still and the world has slowed down just enough for old stories to whisper their way back in, and that's where we come in. If you've got a soft spot for the odd, the ancient, and the oddly ancient, go ahead and like the video and subscribe if this kind of gentle chaos is your thing. Drop your location and local time in the comments too. I love seeing this strange little global village gather in one sleepy place. Now go ahead, dim the lights, let the fan purr, let the shadows stretch across your ceiling like they've heard this story before. And let's step softly into a time long gone, but not quite forgotten. You're walking slowly now, maybe through a misty corridor of crumbling stone. The air is cool, the walls damp with centuries of sighs. And just ahead, yes, that's a heavy wooden door. Iron hinges, probably creaks like your knees when the weather shifts. And behind it, a medieval prisoner who doesn't want to leave. That's the bit that makes your brain go, wait, what? You always imagined prison in the Middle Ages as somewhere between a moldy broom closet and a torture museum. And to be fair, sometimes it was. But as you're about to see, sometimes it was weirdly cozy, or strategic, or oddly preferable to the chaos outside. Imagine a man named Ulrich. He's not famous. His story didn't end up in textbooks, but we're giving him the stage tonight. He's sitting on a wooden bench in a small, drafty cell in a low-level city jail in 14th century Würzburg. He's not chained. In fact, there's a fireplace in the hall and someone's boiling cabbage soup just down the corridor. It smells edible. Mostly. A clerk from the city court swings open the door and says, Ulrich, your case has been dropped. You can go. And Ulrich politely declines. Why? Well, let's look at the facts, like it's a sleepy detective show. For one, Ulrich has no land to return to. His house was repossessed. His cousin is squatting in it now, and frankly, they never got along. Outside, there are debts waiting like wolves. There's a baker, he owes 6 loaves, and a cobbler who still curses his name. But in here, Ulrich has a dry cot, soup on schedule, and the jailer lets him borrow old prayer books when the magistrate's not looking. He even plays dice with the other inmates, though Dieter always cheats and everyone knows it. This isn't freedom exactly, but it's manageable, predictable. For a man who's had his share of chaos, that's not nothing. Historians still argue whether prisoners like Ulrich were making rational choices or simply giving up. Maybe both, but one thing's clear. Medieval prison wasn't always solitary confinement and screaming rats. Sometimes it was more like a halfway house with less paperwork. And then there's the law. Back then, you didn't get sentenced the way modern courts do. You were tossed in jail while everyone argued about what to do with you. Trials could take months, sometimes years. The paperwork was written in Latin and spilled ink everywhere. No one was in a rush, and until a decision was made, you were just there, which led to a strange phenomenon. If a prisoner had a tolerable setup, maybe a blanket from home, a cellmate who snored softly, and a view of the river if you leaned just right, they might not push for a trial, because once sentenced, your fate was locked in. It could mean banishment, branding, even execution, whereas this was just waiting. There's also this deliciously odd detail from the records of the London jails. Some prisoners petitioned to stay in after their acquittal, not because they loved prison exactly, but because they feared what awaited them on the outside. Take Marjorie, an apothecary's widow who was accused of petty theft. She was acquitted, but she begged to remain just one more week. She had nowhere to go. Her old shop had been ransacked. Her sister wouldn't take her in, having declared her an unlucky omen. And here, in this damp brick cube, at least she had soup, again edible-ish. And it's not just desperation. Sometimes it's politics. If you're a low-level noble or merchant, and you know your rivals are waiting outside with forged documents and poisoned pies, the prison walls feel a little protective. The guards might be bribbable, but there's still a buffer. And let's be honest, some of them are kind of nice. Walter the jailer once gave his wool cloak to a prisoner when the snow came early. You begin to see the blurry line between punishment and refuge. And there's this too, the phenomenon of voluntary detention. Sounds like an oxymoron, right? But in the medieval world, if you had broken a minor law and expected a harsh sentence, it sometimes worked in your favor to preemptively surrender. You'd walk up to the constable, bow slightly, and ask to be held while your case was considered. Think of it like medieval damage control, or very dramatic adult timeout. People actually documented their choice to stay longer than required, claiming spiritual retreat, awaiting funds from family, or simply, in the words of one Burgundian mason, "I like the quiet here." And hey, can you blame him? In a world of street brawls, fleas, and taxes, and deeply suspicious meat pies, a stone room with a roof and a regular dinner bell could seem oddly peaceful, like a very grim spa retreat, just minus the rose-scented towels and motivational quotes. And while there were certainly dark, brutal dungeons, and we'll get to those later, many smaller town or church-run prisons functioned more like holding areas, minimal security, light supervision. In some cases, literally no locked doors, just the honor system and maybe a guy named Harold watching the hallway with one good eye and a nose that had definitely seen battle. Here's another fun tidbit. Certain monasteries also acted as prisons, often for clergy or educated criminals. These cells came with books, candles, and a strict no-talking rule. It wasn't solitary in the modern sense, but it was deeply quiet, contemplative. Imagine being sentenced to mandatory reading time. Some people stayed after their sentence ended, claimed they hadn't finished repenting yet. Or maybe the soup was just that good. And that brings us back to Ulrich, still in his little Würzburg cell. The clerk leaves the door ajar, waiting. Ulrich picks up the dice. Dieter grumbles. The cabbage soup bubbles in the hall. You don't always have to run when the door opens. Sometimes the cell feels safer than the street. You shift slightly in your imaginary cot, the straw rustling beneath you, and your feet still a little damp from the cold stone floor. Welcome back to the jailhouse, not the terrifying dungeon of popular lore, but the surprisingly hospitable kind where some folks ate better then the baker's assistant, and played dice on Tuesdays. So let's talk about those meals. Because if you're imagining prison gruel shoveled into bowls by sneering guards, you're only half wrong. Yes, there were bowls. Yes, there were guards. But depending on where and when you found yourself locked up in medieval Europe, the food might surprise you. For instance, some city jails were located within or next to guild halls or parish centers. These were public buildings with reputations to maintain. So if the town wanted to keep its moral image sparkling, and believe me, they often did, it needed its prisoners to appear well treated, or at least fed enough not to haunt the local innkeeper's conscience. In places like York, Bruges, and Florence, prison meals could range from thin porridge and black bread on lean days to meat stew with onions and barley when charity kicked in, especially during holidays when wealthy townsfolk made donations in hopes of boosting their eternal report card. On St. Bartholomew's feast day, prisoners in one French prison were given wine, 2 eggs, and brace yourself, cheese. It was essentially a medieval charcuterie board, minus the tiny forks. Now let's picture Tomasz. He's a minor thief in Krakow, locked up for swiping a merchant's boots. He's 21, probably missing 2 teeth, and deeply apologetic. His cell is small, but near the kitchens, and on market days, the staff tosses him bruised apples and burnt crusts from the bakery cart. It's not fine dining, but it beats wandering hungry through the muddy streets in February. Plus, Tomasz knows how to charm the kitchen maid. He's got jokes, and he once taught her how to catch mice with a bucket and a spoon, which she claims saved her pantry. Prisoners often received food from outside, visiting family members, sympathetic neighbors, or even former victims. Yes, in one very poetic case from Siena, a butcher who had been burgled brought stew to the thief who had stolen from him. He said, and I quote, "He may be a scoundrel, but he's our scoundrel." And here's where it gets even sleepier. Some prisoners actually brought their own cooks. Wait, what? Oh yes. If you were a noble or moderately wealthy merchant under house arrest or held for political reasons, you could often pay for upgraded accommodations, including your own staff, a private cook, a servant, maybe a lute player for ambiance. That's not prison. That's a weekend Airbnb with stricter rules about candle usage. In 15th century Paris, a nobleman accused of plotting against the king was held in the Bastille. Sounds terrifying, right? But his letters reveal he had roast duck, preserved quince, and mulled wine delivered daily. He even had a fireplace in his room and a window overlooking the garden. Historians still argue whether such imprisonment should be considered incarceration at all, or just an inconvenient vacation. But even among the less glamorous prisoners, food became currency. You could trade a good apple for laundry service. Half a sausage could get you a letter copied by a literate cellmate. And if you happened to know how to bake or ferment things, oh, you were golden. There's a delightful record from the 14th century Low Countries of a prisoner nicknamed Ale Pot John. His crime? A brewing license dispute. But in jail, he became the unofficial prison brewer. He convinced the guards to let him ferment weak ale using leftover crusts and herbs from the infirmary. Other inmates would pay him in favors or scraps to get a mug of his mood lifter. It was low alcohol, mildly bitter, and almost certainly terrible, but it was also the social glue of the cell block. And here's a quirky wrinkle: feasts. Yes, real ones. Some jails had communal feast nights, especially during religious festivals. Food donated by monasteries or local guilds was distributed among inmates in big kettles. There are records of fish stew, honey cakes, and even roasted goose turning up in prison feasts. It was less about indulgence and more about salvation, feeding the poor, the lost, and yes, even the incarcerated was considered a holy duty. Picture it: flickering candlelight, guards nodding off in corners, prisoners hunched over steaming bowls, passing gossip like salt. It's not cheerful exactly, but it's familiar, human, and food wasn't just sustenance. It was ritual, a way to mark time, pass long hours, and maintain dignity. The clang of the dinner pot meant the day was ticking forward, even if nothing else was. Even now, as you drift through this story, like a ghost with very comfy socks, you can almost hear the spoon scraping the bottom of the pot, the faint chatter about whether the potatoes were better last Thursday, the muttered argument over whether saffron is too fancy for stew. You may also be wondering, did prisoners cook for themselves? In some cases, yes. Smaller prisons or less staffed jails allowed certain low-risk inmates to prepare meals for others. This was both practical, guards didn't want to do everything, and political, cooking gave prisoners responsibility, which curbed boredom and potential rebellion. In one late medieval Scottish lockup, the lead cook was a man convicted of punching a tax collector. His stew was reportedly thick, loud, and opinionated, which may or may not refer to the flavor. There were even occasional squabbles about kitchen duty, because if you burned the millet again, Robert, we will start a petition to have your spoon revoked. Another fringe detail worth curling your toes around. In some ecclesiastical prisons, monks jailed for misconduct were allowed to fast by choice, yes, voluntarily skip meals, as part of their repentance. This was highly ritualized, and sometimes other monks brought them food to test their willpower, kind of like a reverse bake-off, but with more scripture. You begin to understand medieval prisons were not all doom and gloom. They were human, flawed, improvisational, sometimes unjust, but undeniably shaped by the same odd balance of survival, comfort, and communal routine that shapes any shared living space. By the time your sleepy imagination turns to the next hallway, you might see Ulrich again, this time seated at a table made from an old door propped up by bricks. He's chewing on a bit of bread with something suspiciously resembling rosemary on it. Someone from the outer court tossed him a wedge of goat cheese yesterday. It's sharp and a little sweaty, but he's not complaining. The dice are back out. Tomas just lost another round, and someone's snoring in the corner, likely dreaming of freedom or soup. You realize prison wasn't always punishment. Sometimes it was just the weirdest hostel on earth. You've moved further into the stone maze now, maybe imagining the way your fingers trail along a cold wall smoothed by centuries of brushing cloaks and calloused hands. A torch flickers nearby, casting gentle shadows in slow loops. You're deep in the heart of the jail now, not the darkest corner, but one of the quieter ones. And in this cell, it's not the bars that matter, it's the company, because medieval imprisonment was rarely a solitary affair. In fact, many jails encouraged, or at least tolerated, roommates, cellmates, fellow travelers in the long, slow, waiting game of medieval justice. You can imagine what that might have looked like. A trio of misfits slumped around a dice game, a washerwoman locked up for insulting a priest, a disgraced knight pacing in circles, reciting poetry to no one in particular, and a boy who got caught stealing apples because his shoes squeaked too loudly on the church floor. This wasn't a sitcom, but it was something like a society. Because here's the thing, people are very good at building little communities out of nothing, even in jail, especially in jail. In medieval English jails, for example, it was not uncommon for prisoners to organize themselves into mini hierarchies. There was often a de facto leader, sometimes called the captain or master of the ward. This wasn't an official title, mind you. No one was handing out embroidered badges, but it carried weight. That person would help mediate squabbles, divvy up donated food, and sometimes even negotiate with the guards. If you're picturing a grizzled man with one eyebrow and a voice like gravel, well, sometimes, sure. But the cell captain could also be a school teacher, a disgraced clerk, or a nun gone rogue. The system didn't care much about backstories. What mattered was your ability to keep people calm, fed, and only mildly irritated with each other. Historians still argue whether these informal leadership structures were allowed, encouraged, or simply tolerated. Some suggest they were a practical necessity. Others believe guards used them as a way to avoid doing their own jobs. Either way, they were real and weirdly organized. In a 13th century Neapolitan prison, inmates reportedly held councils to discuss the cell's hygiene, food rations, and whether or not to collectively refuse stew that smelled like boiled sadness. One record shows that a group of 5 prisoners submitted a list of grievances about cell conditions, signed and sealed, as if they were running a neighborhood association, which in a sense they were. And these communities had customs, roles, duties. Someone had to sweep the straw. Someone patched clothes using smuggled thread. Someone, you guessed it, acted as the unofficial therapist, especially after lights out, when the building quieted and regrets started whispering through the cracks. Some prisoners even formed prayer circles, not always pious, mind you. Sometimes it was just rhythmic chanting to stave off boredom or lull the others to sleep. The medieval version of a white noise machine, if you will. Let's meet a new face, Benedetta, a seamstress from Genoa, arrested for forging a signature on a promissory note. Her cellmates include a woman who once impersonated a nun for free wine, a sailor who keeps carving faces into bits of wood, and an elderly baker who won't stop describing pastries in excruciating detail. Together, they've formed a routine. Every morning, Benedetta mends clothes with thread she bartered for using half a wedge of hard cheese. In the afternoon, they all sit around and listen to the sailor's tall tales, tales so obviously false that they've become a running joke. And in the evenings, the baker recites recipes, which they discuss as if reviewing a royal banquet. It's oddly comforting, and if someone new arrives, they're vetted, not with interviews or background checks, but with side eyes, careful conversations, and a trial run of chore assignments. If you sweep the corner without complaint, you're probably fine. If you steal bread, however, Well, you might find yourself exiled to the drafty side of the room. It's not just about survival, it's about dignity. In one Flemish jail, prisoners developed a rotating duty roster. Mondays, floor sweep. Tuesdays, waste emptying. Wednesdays, communal singing. It may sound silly now, but in a time before clocks and calendars ruled life, rituals helped shape the foggy blur of jail time into something recognizable, something human. Even the guards noticed. Some wardens, especially in smaller jails, treated these prisoner communities with a sort of weary respect. They knew that a well organized cell caused fewer problems, less screaming, fewer escape attempts. One Dutch jailer even described his inmates as more orderly than the guild apprentices in town, which is quite frankly not saying much. But still, of course, not every prison fostered harmony. Tensions brewed, rivalries flared, personalities clashed, and space was tight. You could find yourself bunking with someone who muttered curses in their sleep, or who insisted on singing bawdy tavern songs at 2 a.m. through a missing tooth. It was chaotic, but it was also real, tangled, occasionally affectionate. In Prague, there's a record of two prisoners, a petty thief and a former monk, who began writing poetry together on the cell walls. Lines scratched out with bits of bone or charcoal hidden beneath layers of soot and time. Centuries later, fragments of their verses were found, melancholy, witty, and often vaguely insulting toward the warden. You begin to see why someone might hesitate to leave. When you've built a rhythm, a group, a routine, freedom can feel like unraveling a thread you've spent months weaving. And then there's the small matter of shared belongings. If you left early, your blanket might go to someone else, your portion of donated firewood redistributed, your favorite seat near the wall with the least mildew gone. Returning wasn't always an option, so for some, staying meant preserving what little comfort they'd managed to scrape together. Also, just putting this out there, have you ever tried moving during winter in medieval Europe? Exactly. Sometimes the cell was just warmer. There's also something quietly powerful in mutual care. One document from a small prison in Bruges describes how inmates pooled food to help a feverish cellmate. They watered down broth to stretch it farther. One woman reportedly gave up her only blanket for 2 nights so that a shivering youth could sleep. That's not the kind of story that makes it into royal archives, but here, tonight, that kindness matters. Even among criminals, maybe especially among criminals, the impulse to make life a little less miserable survives. So when you imagine these prisoners refusing freedom, you're not just picturing stubborn fools. You're seeing people who found or created some kind of weird makeshift home, with jokes and duties, with petty grievances and shared prayers, with exactly one good pillow that everybody fought over. It wasn't glamorous, but it was theirs. And as the night winds deeper and you nestle more comfortably into your blanket, you can almost hear them, shuffling cards made from parchment scraps, whispering bedtime stories from the street, and tucking into another dreamy bowl of thin, questionable stew. They weren't always free, but sometimes they were okay. Let's say, just for a sleepy second, you're finally free. The cell door has creaked open. The clerk has waved the paper. Your name has been scrawled in something vaguely resembling ink. The guard even gives you a half-hearted thumbs up. You shuffle your things, if you have any, and step out into the hallway. But then you stop, because out there, there's a debt collector. And not just any debt collector. It's Herman, with the one eyebrow and the terrifying memory for interest rates. Welcome to the part of our tale where freedom isn't free. Not in the emotional sense, not in the metaphorical sense, and definitely not in the medieval financial sense. Tonight we're talking about dungeon rent. No, really. In many parts of medieval Europe, especially in urban centers like Nuremberg, Cologne, and even smaller English towns, prisoners were expected to pay for their stay. Yes, the food, the straw mattress, the firewood, sometimes even the chains. These things weren't free. You didn't just get locked up, you got billed. It was called prison fees, jail rent, or depending on the language and century, custody dues. And it was not cheap. If you were a merchant in London's Newgate prison, you might be charged for a cot. If you wanted access to the slightly warmer cell with the window that didn't scream when it swung open, that cost more. If you wanted to avoid the overcrowded, noisier lower cells, yep, that's another fee. And let's not forget the clean blanket surcharge, which, let's be honest, probably meant it was only slightly less crusty. So why would you refuse to leave? Because sometimes stepping out of jail meant stepping into a financial buzzsaw. Let's meet Isabeau. She's been in a small French prison for 3 months. Her crime? Technically nothing. She was brought in for questioning about a disputed inheritance and then forgotten. Her meals are basic. Her mattress is made of hay that squeaks, but she's safe. She even washes linens for the guards in exchange for extra apples. Then the court clerk shows up. "You're free to go," he says. But Isabeau knows the math. Outside, she owes a dressmaker for 3 gowns she tried to sell on consignment. She owes the church a small tithe that she may have gambled away. And worst of all, the moment she steps into the street, she becomes visible again to creditors, to rivals, to all the sharp-eyed busybodies who write letters to bishops and then mysteriously lose them. But in here, in this chilly box with its drafty corner, no one bothers her. She shrugs. "I think I'll stay 1 more week." And the guard nods, because this happens more often than you'd think. Historians still argue whether this was a rational decision based on safety and shelter, or a symptom of a failed legal system that lost people in its own paperwork. Maybe both, likely both. But one thing's certain, refusing freedom wasn't always dramatic. It was sometimes just about balancing accounts. Debt in medieval Europe wasn't like it is today. There were no credit cards, but there were plenty of debtors' prisons. If you owed enough to the wrong person and couldn't repay it on time, you could be thrown in jail because of the debt. But here's the fun paradox. You were still expected to pay your own way while in jail. You might be nodding off right now, and I don't blame you. It's a sleepy kind of injustice, the kind that makes you want to sink a little deeper under the covers and whisper yikes into your pillow. But let's pad gently along this cobbled path a little further. Prisoners had to pay jailers' fees, especially upon entry and exit. There's a record from a 14th century English town where the jailer charged every prisoner a fee just for unshackling them. The logic? The irons must be cleaned after. You can't make this stuff up. So if you were broke, which, let's be honest, most prisoners were, you might prefer to stay in rather than come out only to be fined, chased, or shoved straight into another cell by a different set of creditors. And it wasn't just money. Sometimes, what waited outside was worse than jail: a banishment, a branding, a sentence of public humiliation involving carts, bells, or really awkward donkey rides. In that light, jail suddenly felt like the lesser evil, the devil you knew, the one with the familiar draft, and the guard who sometimes snuck you burnt bread on Wednesdays. There are even cases where families encouraged relatives to stay imprisoned longer, especially when legal negotiations or dowry settlements were still up in the air. Just hang tight in the cell, Uncle Gerard. Aunt Elspeth is still arguing with the bishop's clerk. Imagine trying to explain that at the family reunion. You might think this sounds more like a farce than history, but the records, faint and foxed as they are, paint a strange picture of jails functioning like awkward waiting rooms for lives too messy to resume just yet. And don't forget the bribes. Let's say you wanted to be released, but only under certain conditions. You might offer the warden a bribe: money, favors, information, or you might delay your release to time it with a particular festival or political shift. In other words, some prisoners were playing chess. They weren't refusing freedom because they feared it. They were trying to time it. A record from Lubeck describes a prisoner who declined release 3 separate times until his rival merchant had left the city. "I'll wait until the wind changes," he reportedly said, which might have been metaphorical or might have meant he wanted warmer weather. Hard to say. Germans, like cats, do enjoy comfort. But the idea sticks. Jail was not just punishment. It was a tool, a pause button, a way to reset or avoid or delay. Now let's talk about a very fringe detail. Some prisoners rented out their own spaces. Yes, you heard right. In Italian city-states, there are scattered mentions of subletting, wealthier prisoners paying to reserve certain cells and then lending them to friends or allies and awaiting their own trials. The terms were informal, the results chaotic, but it shows how prison could be gamified, twisted, reshaped into something that wasn't quite prison anymore. And that brings us to the dreamier side of this strange tale. If you're lying there, blinking slowly now, your thoughts drifting between the sound of your fan and the mental image of a clay cup full of sad stew, remember this: freedom wasn't always the glowing doorway it seems. For some, it was a return to hunger, violence, and endless debt. For others, it was a risky game they weren't ready to play. And for a few clever souls, refusing release was the smartest move they could make. The jail wasn't a cage. It was a shield, a pause, a badly heated monastery of sorts, with less Latin and more soup. Outside, the world was loud. Inside, it was manageable, and that made all the difference. The lantern light swings softly above now, casting long shadows on the walls that look more like paintings than punishment. You're walking deeper still, down a corridor of echoes and sleeping voices, and this time you hear laughter. Low, muffled, but unmistakably human. Someone just lost a bet. Someone else is snoring through it. You've stumbled into one of the strangest and most comforting truths of medieval prison life. Some people live together behind bars, by choice. That's right. Let's unroll the parchment on cellmates by choice, a concept that sounds like the start of a sitcom, but was very much a feature of how some jails operated, especially the civic ones. Now remember, medieval prisons weren't institutions in the modern sense. There were no standardized uniforms, no identical concrete blocks with buzzing fluorescent lights. These were often haphazard structures, converted towers, wings of town halls, abandoned chapels, old watch posts turned into holding pens. They were designed more for containment than correction, which meant that if there was space, you might just get to choose your cellmates. You step into a room, not much bigger than a modern bedroom. 4 or 5 people already live here. 2 have spread straw for sleeping. 1 has hung up a bit of cloth to create a privacy curtain that provides absolutely zero privacy. And one is carving a checkerboard into the floor with a nail and humming very off-key. This is a voluntary micro-society, born of necessity and boredom, and surprisingly, choice. In larger urban prisons, like those in Florence, Paris, or York, prisoners might have some say in who they were housed with. This could depend on status, connections, or just a well-timed bribe to the turnkey. And while some were stuck wherever space allowed, others cultivated entire little ecosystems of people they wanted around them. Why? Because sharing a cell meant shared food, shared chores, shared protection, and crucially, shared conversation. And conversation, that was currency. Imagine you're in a dark, cramped room, and someone nearby can recite the Romance of the Rose from memory. That person becomes a precious commodity. You trade a piece of salted fish just to hear the next stanza. In some prisons, storytellers became the unofficial entertainment directors. They made the nights go faster. They helped you forget what was waiting or not waiting outside. Even now, lying on your back with your phone tipped sideways and your pillow just the right temperature, you can imagine how sweet a voice might sound in the dark, telling stories of distant cities and even more distant freedoms. In some jails, cellmates set up rotas, systems of responsibility. One person cooked, if the guards allowed it. One person cleaned. One person patched everyone's socks or tunics. One person kept lookout for surprise inspections. The duties rotated. Arguments happened, but it was life, something to grasp. In the Tower of London, during the 15th century, high-profile prisoners sometimes requested specific companions, often for reasons of comfort or political safety. Sharing a cell with a friend or a loyal retainer meant someone would have your back if the interrogators got rough. It also meant someone to pass the time with, to help you write your memoirs, or to dramatically reenact your trial using burnt toast as props. And it wasn't all nobles and their manservants. There's a curious record from Kent in which 3 women, all imprisoned for different reasons, petitioned the warden to stay together in the same cell. They wrote that they passed the time in psalms and peaceful chatter, and that separation would provoke unrest in the spirit. Translation, don't split us up. We've got a good thing going. Historians still argue whether those bonds were always genuine or sometimes just convenient. Were they spiritual sisters, strategic roommates, secret romantic partners? Possibly all 3. The records don't tell us, but the candles they burned in shared silence probably hold the answer. One particularly bizarre case from Milan. A prisoner named Matteo managed to convince 2 of his cellmates to form a sort of rotating playwriting troupe. They wrote short comedies in Latin, badly, rehearsed them by candlelight, and performed them in exchange for favors, food, gossip, or just a better seat near the fire. And when Matteo was offered early release, He refused. "The play's not done," he said. That's not a metaphor. That's an actual quote, probably delivered with dramatic flair and a cheese rind for a monocle. You begin to understand. Behind bars, people made homes. Not beautiful ones, not safe ones, but real ones. Threadbare, mismatched, but functional. Some shared a cell because they feared the guards. Others simply couldn't stand silence. And a few found something like friendship, the kind that only grows when time drips like honey and nothing else is certain. In one case from Avignon, two men, former rivals in trade, ended up cellmates for nearly 7 months. They began by arguing constantly, especially about the correct way to sharpen a quill. By month 3, they were collaborating on letters. By month 6, they had drafted a formal business partnership to open a bookstall together if and when they were released. Did they ever get out? Records trail off, but it's not the outcome that matters. It's the way time forged connection out of circumstance. And that's the heartbeat of this strange little world, because in the outside world, relationships were complicated, ruled by class, reputation, politics. But in jail, in this quiet, cold room where everyone smells faintly of straw and onions, you are all just people, tired, trying. There's even a record of a cell where 5 men pooled their coins to bribe a guard for writing supplies, not to plan an escape, not to write angry letters to the court, but to create a round-robin journal where they each wrote an entry every day. A medieval group diary full of daydreams and doodles and really bad poetry about boiled cabbage. It's ridiculous. It's sweet. It's real. You can almost see them now, one hunched over the parchment, tongue poking out as he thinks of a rhyme for damp, another passing him a stub of candle, a third humming a tune no one remembers the name of. When release came, 2 of them left. One asked to stay just a while longer. Another refused entirely, because you can build a life, even in ruins. And when you've made something, however fragile, you don't always want to start over. So the next time someone asks, why didn't they leave? Picture that checkerboard carved into stone. Picture the shared blanket, the whisper of psalms, the half laugh in the dark. Picture the play that's not done. And maybe, just maybe, you'll understand. You're walking now past a barred window, one that rattles ever so slightly in the wind. A breeze slips in, not cold, just cool enough to brush your cheek and make you wonder what lies beyond this place. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolls, not for danger, not for mourning, just time, trudging onward like it always does. In this next room, someone's sitting very still, back against the wall, eyes closed, not sleeping, but meditating maybe. And no, this isn't a monk. This is a prisoner, one who could leave, but doesn't. Why? Because escape would be rude. Let's talk about a deeply odd, but very real medieval concept. The idea that escaping prison was bad manners. You heard that right. In many corners of the medieval world, especially among towns where reputation was everything and where jails weren't fortress-like but more like suggested confinement, breaking out wasn't just illegal, it was socially tacky. Let's unravel that sleepy style. To begin with, not all prisons were high-security nightmares. Some had no locks at all. In certain Scandinavian towns and across smaller German city-states, jails operated on what could only be called the medieval honor system. You were told not to leave, and you just kind of didn't. Sure, a guard might glance in once or twice, but in many cases, if you bolted, no one was sprinting after you with a net and a dog named Ragnar. Instead, you'd get a letter, a fine, or worse, whispers at market. That's right. You'd become that person, the one who couldn't be trusted, the one who spoiled the system for everyone else. One 14th century town near Lübeck even maintained a wall of shame, names of escaped prisoners painted near the well, not in red ink, not even with skulls, just simple writing. But people saw it, read it, and trust was lost. So let's say you're Klaus. You're locked up for accidentally insulting a town alderman's hat, which was, to be fair, terrible. You're held in a small civic jail with two others. The door unlocked. The guards mostly on break. You could leave, but if you do, you're dishonoring the trust placed in you. You're spitting in the face of the warden who winked and said, "We'll sort this out soon." You're mocking the cook who gave you extra bread and called you dear. And you will get caught, not because of nights or manhunts, but because someone's cousin will see you at the mill and squint suspiciously, because someone's niece will overhear you ordering lentils, and word will spread like jam on warm bread. And then the punishment is worse, not just legally, socially. You lose your standing, your guild membership, your spot in the festival procession. You're no longer Klaus the unlucky hat insulter. You're Klaus the one who ran. And here's the real kicker. In some towns, that dishonor extended to your family. Your sister might lose her baking license. Your nephew might be skipped over for choir boy of the month. This wasn't just law. It was shame. Long, sticky, impossible to wash out shame. Historians still argue whether this sense of civic guilt was truly internalized or whether towns enforced it through gossip and soft power. Some call it communal justice. Others call it weaponized disappointment. Either way, it worked. There's a case from Bergen, Norway, in which a man named Alf was arrested for a minor trade infraction. He was placed under house arrest, which meant he had to stay in the northern wing of his own home and not step beyond it. He could see the market from his window. He could hear his wife laughing in the garden. But for 3 weeks, he stayed. When asked why, he said, "Because they asked me to." That's it. That was enough. And lest you think this was only a northern thing, consider the Italian concept of custodia honorata, or honorable custody. Nobles arrested for debts or duels were often confined to agreed-upon spaces, sometimes rooms within their own palazzi, and expected not to leave until permitted. And they didn't, because escape would have been embarrassing. Even among less polished prisoners, the idea held sway. One Germanic jail manual from the 1300s includes a list of discourteous behaviors, and right between insulting the steward and misusing the chamber pot is leaving the premises uninvited, not escaping, not fleeing, just leaving, like a guest overstaying their welcome and then bolting mid-dinner. There's also evidence that some prisoners, especially those in debtors' jails, signed agreements before entering custody. These documents stated that if they did escape, their entire family would be held liable. Now, whether this was actually enforceable is murky, but the threat alone was usually enough. So escaping wasn't just risky, it was awkward. And in medieval society, awkward could be just as terrifying as jail. Which brings us to one of my favorite fringe details, the medieval apology letter. Yes, in at least 2 recorded instances, escaped prisoners wrote back to the jail they'd fled from to apologize. One from Bruges reads, "To the warden whose kindness I betrayed, forgive me my haste. The forest was less kind than your hearth." He literally regretted it, like a child sneaking out of a sleepover and missing the snacks. Even now, tucked under your covers, you can imagine it. Someone slipping out under the cover of darkness, tiptoeing through the woods, mud up to their ankles, and by dawn, deeply missing their cell's leaky roof and neighbors' annoying snore. Because sometimes the known discomfort is better than the terrifying unknown. And that idea, that escape is more trouble than it's worth, that comfort, even dusty, drafty comfort, is preferable to disgrace. It's deeply human, not noble, not tragic, just relatable. You've probably felt it in your own way. The job you stayed at too long because quitting felt rude. The party you didn't leave early because the host looked so proud of the dip. The moment you realized freedom sometimes feels lonelier than confinement. Now multiply that by medieval stakes, by oaths, by reputation, by a society where everything was face to face and nothing disappeared into inboxes. It's no wonder some stayed put. Better to wait, to explain, to nod politely to the guard who brings your porridge, and say, maybe tomorrow. So next time someone says, "Why didn't they run?" just smile sleepily and remember, in 1342, in a jail with no locks and a guard who mostly napped, not a single soul left because it simply wasn't done. Another hallway, this one quieter. Stone walls closer together, like they're leaning in to listen. A chill runs down your spine, not from fear, but from the hush. You've reached a different part of the jail now. Not darker, necessarily, but different, more reverent. You notice something carved into the wall, Latin. Maybe a prayer, maybe a date, maybe a name trying not to be forgotten. Because in this wing of our slow-motion journey, the prison isn't just a cell, it's a sanctuary. Tonight, we're stepping softly into the strange and blurry space between imprisonment and religious retreat. You probably didn't expect those words to sit next to each other, but in the medieval world, paradoxes were practically a design feature. And in the case of monastic lockups and holy cells, the line between punishment and pilgrimage got very, very fuzzy. Picture this: a cloistered corner of a Benedictine abbey, the floors swept daily, the walls whitewashed, maybe faintly glowing in candlelight. Inside a small side room, a man kneels. He's not a monk, not officially. He's a merchant who got a little too creative with weights and measures. But rather than a public flogging or a stay in the town jail, he's been sent here for spiritual correction. He's not locked in. There's no guard with a spear, just a vow and a door that creaks when opened, but no one opens it. This practice, penitential confinement, was common enough to have its own rhythms, rituals, and vocabulary. In many places, particularly in Italy, Spain, and parts of France, local courts would assign offenders to religious houses rather than civic prisons, especially if the crime wasn't violent, or if the offender had friends in slightly illuminated places. This wasn't always kindness. It was about control of behavior, of the soul, of the story. Within a monastery's walls, the guilty could be watched, guided, rehabilitated, or at least kept quiet. Now let's meet Elodia, a young woman from Aragon. She was accused of scandalous behavior, nothing specific, which is often how these things went. Too loud, too free, too unwilling to follow whatever version of propriety her town believed in that week. Rather than throw her into a town jail, the local priest arranged for her to be confined to a small prayer cell in the nearby convent. There, she was expected to reflect, to fast, to copy psalms in the morning and sweep cloisters in the evening. She shared meals with the nuns, though she sat at a separate table, a subtle but ever-present reminder that she didn't quite belong. But here's the twist. Elodia liked it. The convent was quiet, predictable, no jeering in the streets, no leering neighbors, no gossip at the market, just bells, prayers, and candle wax slowly dripping down pewter holders. When her 6-month confinement ended, she requested to stay. The nuns, taken aback but ultimately amused, allowed her to remain as a lay helper. Historians still argue whether she did this out of faith, fatigue, or sheer relief. Probably all three. This practice of spiritual confinement had variations. In England, the church sometimes offered sanctuary to the accused. If someone ran to a church, literally clinging to the altar, they could claim the right of asylum. The law couldn't touch them for 40 days. During that time, the person was expected to either negotiate a pardon, agree to exile, or confess and accept some form of penance. Some stayed. There's a tale, whispered through dusty legal records, of a thief in Durham who claimed sanctuary, then simply never left. He slept in the side chapel, cleaned floors, and became a sort of unofficial church mouse. After a year, the priest stopped asking when he'd go. Another layer of this odd tapestry, religious penance cells. Some monasteries had built-in cells not for outsiders, but for their own. Monks who broke vows, spoke too loudly, or, in one documented case, kept sneaking honeycomb from the kitchen, might be confined for a period of reflection. But these weren't torture chambers. They were quiet rooms with writing desks, often with small windows looking out over gardens or courtyards. A monk might spend a week there, copying manuscripts, praying, and learning to not steal dessert. One such monk, Brother Eglantine, wrote in his journal that he preferred the silence of correction to the chatter of meal bells. Whether this was sincere or shade directed at his talkative table mates, we may never know. And sometimes, prisoners sought these holy cells voluntarily. Let's say you're Otto, a blacksmith's apprentice who accidentally wounded a rival during a scuffle over iron prices. You fear retribution. You know the local lord favors the other man. Instead of waiting for the knock at your door, you go to the priory, you kneel, you ask to be taken in for repentance. The priory agrees. You're given a cot, bread, and a candle. You vow obedience, and for 3 months you become a ghost within stone walls. Hammer replaced by hymn, sweat traded for incense, and then, when the drama has died down, you emerge, calmer, forgotten by the law, remembered only by the cellar master who says you stacked wine barrels wrong every time. There's a dreamy, odd comfort to all of this. In these holy cells, you weren't just a prisoner. You were a soul in process, a puzzle being reassembled. You were watched over, yes, but also fed, herds, guided, often by people who thought they were doing divine work. Even now, you might imagine yourself there, candlelight flickering, a soft blanket, albeit a bit scratchy, the distant drone of plainsong echoing through stone arches. You're not quite a monk, not quite a criminal, just a person who's paused, who needed a stop, and while you know the world outside still spins, markets, messes, mule carts full of fish, you're in here, still, softly placed between silence and structure. It's not glamorous, but it is gentle, and in a world that so often wasn't, that gentleness mattered. So when we talk about medieval prisoners who refused freedom, remember, sometimes they weren't confined at all. Sometimes they asked to stay, because in a candlelit corner with ink-stained fingers and a roof that only leaked a little, they finally, blessedly, exhaled. You pass under an archway now, this one less humble and far more ornate. The floor beneath your feet feels smoother, the air a little warmer. The musty scent of damp stone fades, replaced by something richer, wood smoke maybe, or saffron if you stretch your imagination and nose far enough. You've entered a different kind of prison now. This one has rugs. Yes, welcome to the paradox of noble imprisonment, where incarceration came with feather beds, fireplaces, and occasionally poached pears in wine. Because in the hierarchy-obsessed medieval world, even your jail cell had to match your social rank. If you were born into power or wealth and found yourself on the wrong side of a feud, throne, or overly dramatic dinner conversation, your punishment would be appropriately luxurious. Not freedom, but not exactly squalor either. Let's set the stage with the Tower of London, perhaps the most iconic medieval prison of all. High walls, cold stone, ravens looming dramatically in every BBC drama. But here's the twist. For many nobles, the tower wasn't a dank dungeon. It was a suite. High-born prisoners, especially political ones, were often granted chambers, not cells. Chambers with furniture and tapestries, even writing desks. Some brought their own books, others brought families, or dogs, or in one spectacular case, a personal lute player whose job was simply to strum gently while the prisoner wrote his memoirs. Take Charles, Duke of Orleans. Captured at Agincourt in 1415, he spent over 20 years as a prisoner in England. You might imagine him in chains, but in truth, he wrote poetry, a lot of poetry. He had servants, warm food, regular correspondence, and possibly access to fresher produce than half the surrounding villages. Historians still debate whether this arrangement was meant to preserve dignity or to make the punishment last longer. Was it kindness or cruelty with velvet drapes? We may never know. What we do know is this. Noble prisoners paid their own way. These weren't state-sponsored spa treatments. Your family, if they valued your name, had to fund your stay. Food, firewood, a scribe if you wanted one, sometimes even wine, though the records rarely list quantity. One suspects it was as much as possible thanks. Let's meet a fictional friend, Lady Aveline of Aquitaine. She's been accused of sympathizing with the wrong side during a border conflict. She's not thrown into a cell, She's assigned a guest suite in a fortified manor under guard. There's a fireplace, a window. She's allowed to walk the gardens twice a day, supervised, of course, and every Thursday she receives fresh linens embroidered with her family crest. It's not freedom, but it's also not cabbage water and wet straw. She passes the time reading religious texts, sewing, poorly, and pretending not to overhear the guards arguing about soup recipes outside her door. Occasionally, a sympathetic cousin smuggles in gossip from court, and in those stolen whispers, she feels more imprisoned than ever because luxury doesn't erase tension. Just because the pillows are plump doesn't mean your head rests easy. One of the oddest details from this era, nobles were sometimes required to entertain. That's right, hosts under house arrest. Imagine being told, "We're keeping you here for reasons of national security, but could you also prepare tea for the bishop's envoy?" In 15th century Burgundy, a nobleman accused of treason was confined to his estate under supervision and expected to continue hosting official guests. These guests were told to treat the residents as neutral, which is a polite way of saying, don't bring up that whole conspiracy thing. And let's not forget the rules. Even in comfort, noble prisoners were watched. Letters were read. Visitors monitored. Some staff were often spies in fancy aprons. And always, there was the threat of transfer to something less polite, less warm. So the noble prisoner learned to behave, to wait, to charm, to endure. Some found creative ways to rebel, hidden messages in embroidery, poems with double meanings, elaborate chess games that hinted at strategy far beyond the board. And some asked to stay even after their charges were dropped. That's the quiet, astonishing truth here. Because imagine, you've been imprisoned for months, maybe years, and now the papers are signed. The door opens. But where do you go? Back to a court that no longer trusts you? To lands seized during your absence? To rumors you can't silence and alliances you can't unpick? In contrast, your chamber, however gilded, has become your shell. Familiar, predictable, safe. So you hesitate. We have records of such refusals. Nobles who lingered, who cited poor weather or fragile nerves, who wrote politely worded letters asking if they might stay a little longer for the sake of the roses, or until spring comes, or until it feels less like stepping into a room where everyone knows you were accused of treason. Historians call these cases extended detentions, but between the lines, you hear it. Fear, exhaustion, uncertainty, and maybe, beneath it all, a strange kind of peace, because the walls that once confined you can, over time, begin to feel like boundaries you chose. That fireplace, once flickering behind a locked door, now glows like a friend. That scribe who once copied letters on your behalf now knows your favorite metaphors. That bed, however firm, has remembered your shape, and when the world outside feels like walking into a room mid-argument, you might just whisper, "Not yet." So when we talk about prisoners who refused freedom, don't forget the feather pillows, the wine, the half-finished embroidery of a lion eating a flower. The idea that dignity, once bruised, sometimes hides in the familiar echo of footsteps down a guarded hall. And perhaps, if you listen closely, you can still hear Lady Aveline humming by the window. She's not quite free, but she's warm. The hallway narrows now, the walls rougher, more weathered. The warmth of fireplaces and velvet fades behind you, replaced by the cool breath of stone and the quiet groan of wood beams shifting overhead. A distant creak, a pigeon feather tumbles past in the gloom. You're back in the heart of things now, where waiting becomes its own form of imprisonment. Tonight, you'll sit with those for whom jail wasn't just punishment or protection. It was limbo, because sometimes the true burden of medieval imprisonment wasn't the food or the straw or the snoring neighbor. It was the waiting, waiting for trials that might never come, for officials who forgot, for systems too sluggish to care. Let's take a slow walk through the molasses-thick mechanics of medieval justice. Unlike today's scheduled hearings and deadline-driven bureaucracy, which, let's be honest, still loves to dawdle, the legal systems of medieval Europe operated at a pace that can only be described as deeply nap-friendly. Courts met seasonally, not daily. Judges were itinerant, wandering like medieval pop stars from town to town. Paperwork was scarce, and when it did exist, it was often written in squiggles no one could read without squinting, and a Latin dictionary the size of a goat. So if you were arrested, you weren't immediately tried. You were held until the right people had time, ink, and interest. This could take months, years. In one famous case from late 13th century England, a man charged with trespassing waited 7 years for trial, not because the crime was complicated, but because the clerk died and no one could decipher his notes. Let's sit beside someone like that now. Meet Hugo, a wool trader in York, wrongly accused of transporting dyed cloth through a guild-only gate, which apparently was a capital offense in the minds of extremely bored gatekeepers. He's held in a small stone jail above the market square. His window faces a wall. His straw bed is fine. He shares it with a cat that comes and goes without paying rent. His trial was scheduled for June. It's now October of the next year. Every few weeks, someone tells him, soon a clerk pokes in to say the magistrate is traveling. The magistrate returns and discovers that his lunch has gone missing, blames the baker, holds an emergency inquiry into breadcrumbs. Trial delayed again. In the meantime, Hugo reads prayers aloud, copies a few for others, and has perfected his stare wistfully at nothing technique. He could try to leave, but that would mean guilt. Fleeing equals confession, even if the charge is flimsy. So he waits, and here's the astonishing part. He's not alone. Prisons throughout Europe were clogged not with hardened criminals, but with people awaiting trial. Not convicted, not sentenced, just waiting. A backlog of hope and hay. Some jails tried to manage this by releasing low-priority detainees on main prize, a sort of medieval bail. But that only worked if you had a sponsor, money, or a reputation that hadn't been flattened like old bread under a wagon wheel. Most didn't. So instead, they waited for messages, for letters, for the right lord to return from crusade and finally sign a verdict. Historians still argue whether this delay-based detention was a calculated control method or simply institutional drift. Was the slowness the point, or just the result of a system built from wax seals, mud-slick roads, and extremely opinionated scribes? Meanwhile, time inside became sludge. Days blended, meals repeated, conversations recycled like rainwater in a cracked bucket. People tracked seasons by which pigeons nested above the windows. Someone might scrawl the same poem on the wall 7 times, not because it was good, but because it was something to do. And yet, for some, that endless waiting began to feel safer than release. Because if you're Hugo and you've been sitting in the same spot for 20 months, the rhythm starts to soothe you. Wake, pray, eat, stare, sleep, repeat. You've learned every creak of the door, every cough in the hallway. The guards know your name. You've made peace with the cat. You know how many spoonfuls of stew it takes to reach the bottom of the bowl. Freedom? That's chaos now. Outside, the world has changed. Your clients have moved on. Your family may have assumed you fled or died. You're a ghost in your own life. So when someone finally says, "You're free to go," you pause, you blink, you ask if you can finish your stew first, because at this point, starting over feels harder than staying still. Let's not forget the structural nightmare either. In many regions, jailers didn't just hold prisoners, they were responsible for presenting them to court. If someone escaped, the jailer could be fined. Or worse. So jailers had a vested interest in keeping prisoners inside, even if the courts forgot about them. In a grimly comedic loop, this often led to jailers forgetting to remind the judges that certain inmates were still waiting. Paperwork went missing, names slipped off lists, and so people like Hugo just waited. One warden in 14th century France kept a prisoner locked up for 2 years longer than necessary simply because the parchment listing his name was used to patch a leaky window. And here's your fringe tidbit. In some cities, particularly in Flanders, prisoners awaiting trial were allowed to send reminder letters to the court. These letters, dictated or written by scribes, usually started with flowery greetings and then gently begged the court to please, for the love of all saints, decide whether the prisoner was guilty already. You can imagine the tone. "Dear honorable judges, I hope your autumn is bountiful. I continue to rot politely in cell 3. Any updates would be appreciated." Sometimes the letter worked. More often, it got placed in a stack labeled winter business and forgotten until Lent. So why did prisoners stay? Because they had to. But also because after a certain point, it was easier than confronting the idea that your life had moved on without you, that the people you loved might have stopped waiting, that your shop might now sell poultry instead of wool, that your name might be remembered only as a cautionary tale at feast tables. And so you stayed. You copied your poems. You counted the pigeons. You waited for a door to open that might never open. And if it did, you weren't sure you'd step through. Not right away, because sometimes the scariest thing isn't the cell. It's what's no longer waiting on the other side. The corridor shifts again. A little warmer, a little closer, a little stranger. You're in a part of the jail now that hums with a different kind of quiet. Not isolation, not resignation, something else, something more complicated. This is the place where bonds are built, not of iron, but of something stickier, stranger, harder to break. Because sometimes prisoners didn't just get used to their jailers. Sometimes they actually liked them. Welcome to the foggy world of medieval affection between the imprisoned and the imprisoners. Now, it's easy to imagine a jailer as a gruff figure with a jangling ring of keys and an expression like boiled beef. And yes, many fit at that mold. But real life is messier, and time, especially the kind that drips slowly through uneventful weeks, has a way of softening even the harshest outlines. Spend enough days handing a man his supper, enough evenings checking the same window latch, and you stop being strangers. Start being people. Start sharing nods, then stories, then favors, and then, well, let's meet Gertrude, a jailer's daughter in a small Bavarian town. Her father, Otto, was responsible for a trio of prisoners, minor offenders. One of them, Lucas, a baker's apprentice with sticky fingers and a winning grin, began helping Otto with chores around the jail, carrying wood, fetching water, shoveling snow in the courtyard. Over time, Lucas earned Otto's trust and Gertrude's attention. One winter, Gertrude smuggled him a slice of almond cake she'd made. She said it was because he looked cold. He said it tasted better than anything his own mother had made. A week later, she brought him an extra blanket. By spring, Lucas was fixing the jail's broken fence and eating meals at the same table as the guards. Did he still sleep in a locked cell? Yes, but the lock was often optional. Now, was this an isolated incident? Not at all. In many small towns, the lines between jailer and jailed were porous, especially when the jail was literally the basement or side wing of the jailer's own house. That's right. Some jailers lived above or beside the cells. Their families did too, which meant prisoners heard babies crying, smelled stews cooking, and listened to lullabies through thin walls. It was, in some ways, a deeply strange version of boarding school, one where you couldn't leave, but you did get invited to Sunday soup if you behaved. Some jailers got attached to their charges, genuinely. There's a record from London in which a jailer named Thomas petitioned the court to reduce the sentence of a young man imprisoned for brawling, saying he was of good temper, strong arms, and uncommon respect. He also added that the man had repaired the jail's broken roof tiles without being asked. You can almost hear the subtext. He's not just a prisoner, he's useful, he's mine. Historians still argue whether these relationships were transactional, emotional, or both. Many suggest a kind of psychological phenomenon, not unlike what we now call Stockholm Syndrome, but reversed, or maybe shared. Prisoners came to rely on their captors for kindness. Jailed men and women found themselves liking, sometimes even loving, the very people meant to keep them in chains. And those jailers, they were often just townsfolk doing their job, underpaid, overworked, half-bored. A polite prisoner who helped scrub the floor or told good jokes during long, cold nights was less a threat and more a colleague. Over time, some guards gave privileges, longer walks, softer bedding, a cup of ale on holidays. One letter from a Spanish town in 1392 describes a prisoner receiving stewed pears and warm milk from the warden's own hearth, owing to his patience and neat handwriting. Another jailer in Bruges hired his favorite prisoner to copy documents because the man had better Latin than the clerk. And yet, these were still prisons. There were still bars, rules, risks. Prisoners who got too close could find themselves reclassified as manipulators. Guards who showed too much favor could be accused of dereliction, or worse, corruption. One particularly messy case from Genoa involves a merchant accused of bribery who charmed his way into the jailer's good graces so thoroughly that he essentially redecorated his cell into a reading room. Eventually, town officials caught wind and reassigned both men. The prisoner was released. The jailer? Demoted to poultry tax enforcement. No one wins in a scandal. Still, the pattern lingers because you don't see the same person every day. Share meals, small talk, winter silence, without forming something, even now, nestled under your blanket. You can imagine it. A prisoner sitting by a fire the jailer has let them tend. The guard listening to the prisoner's dreams of opening a brewery someday. The prisoner offering the guard tips on mending a broken bootstrap. There's a strange intimacy in shared boredom, in long-term proximity without violence, in the little rituals of handing over food, water, parchment. One of the more touching records comes from a Flemish prison where a female guard was tasked with watching over a woman accused of heresy. Over months, the two grew close. When the charges were dropped, the prisoner refused to leave immediately, not out of fear, but sadness. They had, in her words, found something of gentleness in each other. So what does this tell us? That prison was more than stone. It was relational. It held not just the punished, but the punisher. And in between them, 100 small kindnesses, 1,000 unspoken negotiations, a little bread extra, a candle relit, a name remembered. And when the day finally came, when the door creaked open and the jailer said, "You're free," more than one prisoner paused, looked back, nodded, and said something soft. Thank you, because sometimes the only person who saw you, day after day, in your worst and most patient self, was the one holding the keys. The light changes here, not brighter exactly, but busier, like someone's always just passed through, dragging with them the scent of ink, flour, maybe a smuggled candle or two. You're not in the quietest corner anymore. This wing of the prison, it's humming. Tonight, we're stepping into a part of jail life that might surprise you. The part where people get stuff done. Because in the late Middle Ages, prisons weren't always idle spaces of waiting and weeping. Sometimes they were functional, bustling even, and more than one prisoner managed to carve out a little career from behind bars, sometimes literally. So let's push open the creaking wooden door and peek into the world of working prisoners, scribes, merchants, even entertainers who turned their sentences into side hustles. We'll start with something simple, writing. Many prisoners could not read or write, but a few could. And if you could, you were golden. Why? Because letters still needed to be written, records needed copying, and other prisoners, desperate to petition the court or write home, needed your skills. Take Brother Wilhelm, an educated monk imprisoned for, shall we say, overenthusiastic borrowing from the monastery wine cellar. While awaiting a decision on whether his behavior counted as theft or improper spiritual exuberance, he was housed in a modest cell in Mainz. He had ink, he had parchment, and he had a gift for flattery. So he became the prison's unofficial scribe. For a piece of cheese or half a biscuit, he'd write your petition to the bishop, your apology to your wife, or your very creatively edited will. Some days he earned more food than he could eat. Other days he was paid in poetry, once in a pair of gently used boots. Historians have even found prison letters signed by the scribe, not the prisoner, as if to say, he said this, but I made it sound much better. Outside your blanket cocoon, it might seem bizarre that someone would work in jail, but inside the walls, routine was survival and usefulness was currency. You weren't just a burden if you had a skill. You were valuable, and not just in writing. Some prisoners turned to craft. In Florence, one small jail housed a former jeweler who made rosary beads from boiled fruit pits. Another, in Ghent, had a cobbler who repaired the jailer's shoes in exchange for extra firewood. In some places, jails developed reputations for housing talented artisans, convicted or awaiting trial, but still able to sew, mend, carve, patch, or paint. The outside world caught wind, requests came in, and soon you had something like a micro-economy. Let's visit a more raucous cell, the one with the musician. In Bruges, 1438, a fiddler named Peter was jailed for playing provocative songs in front of a noblewoman's estate. The charges were vague, the music allegedly very catchy. Once inside, he did what he always did. He played. At first, it annoyed everyone, but slowly it became background noise. Then it became a ritual. He played during chores, at meals, before sleep. Eventually, guards requested songs. One of them had a cousin getting married and asked Peter to compose something less bawdy than his usual fare. Peter obliged. He became so popular that he began earning small payments, bread, coins, even a chicken once, from people outside the jail who came to hear him through the bars. When his sentence ended, Peter refused to leave right away. He said he wanted to finish writing a tune for the warden's daughter's name day. He left a week later with more money in his shoe than when he came in. And then there's the prison entrepreneur. One of the strangest documents to drift down to us from medieval Catalonia is a jail ledger listing cell-to-cell services. There was a man, name unknown, who offered haircuts. Another sharpened knives. And one, known only as the reader, charged a crumb of cake to read aloud letters or prayers in a dramatic voice. These jails weren't just holes in the wall. They were economies, tiny, uneven, slightly grim marketplaces of need and offer. And like any economy, they had rules. One cell in Paris operated a strict barter policy. Porridge for sewing, firewood for gossip, socks for silence. A surprisingly popular deal. Guards sometimes looked the other way. Sometimes they used the system. There's a report of a jailer in Lyon who routinely bought soap from a prisoner who made it from ashes, lard, and lavender smuggled in via an extremely accommodating cousin. And while not every jail allowed this kind of commerce, many simply couldn't stop it. The structure wasn't modern. There weren't cameras, there weren't daily inspections, there were just tired guards, tired prisoners, and the universal human impulse to make something out of boredom. Even in death, that impulse lingered. In London's Newgate, it was recorded that one prisoner left behind a set of handwritten fables. Short, strange little tales written in margins and scraps, full of animals arguing about taxes. Some guards kept them. One was copied and passed on to a scribe, who added a note. Written by a man who told stories better than truth. And there it is, because truth in a place like this wasn't always kind, but stories, songs, soap, those could make the days bearable. So when prisoners were offered release and they paused, you have to understand they weren't just leaving a cell, they were leaving a life, a job, a rhythm, a handful of customers, a bed warmed by utility, a routine shaped by use. And yes, maybe a musical gig that paid in chickens. It wasn't glamorous, but it was something. And sometimes, something is all you need to stay one more week. You're descending now, gently into the soft belly of the jail, somewhere between history and hibernation. The walls here are older. The air is thicker. This part of the prison doesn't hum or creak. It sighs, like a very tired house that has accepted its drafty fate. And in these sighing corners, you find the strangest truth yet. For some medieval prisoners, jail wasn't just better than the outside world. It was preferable, because tonight we're sinking into the reality of chains with benefits, the unexpected perks of being locked away, especially when compared to the chaotic, cruel, and often absurd life waiting outside. And if that sounds strange, consider this. What if the worst place you could go wasn't a stone cell, but home? Let's start with the battlefield. You're a young foot soldier, recently captured in a skirmish. Instead of being executed or forced into labor, you're imprisoned. That sounds grim. But in prison, you're fed, so protected, you have a roof. You don't have to march through the rain, dodge arrows, or watch your friends die for someone else's ego. And maybe, just maybe, if you behave, they'll ransom you back or forget you altogether. In the meantime, you've got stew and a roommate who sings like a sleepy goat. You're not fighting anymore, and that, in the 14th century, is practically a vacation. Then there's taxes. In some cities, imprisonment exempted you from certain levies. It wasn't official policy. It was just how things shook out. If you were in jail, no one could shake you down for church fees, tithes, market taxes, or the endlessly aggravating roof tile assessments that seemed to sprout from nothing. In a particularly quirky case from Bologna, a man arrested for a civil dispute remained in jail for 3 months longer than necessary because it helped him avoid collection agents who were trying to fine him for allegedly stealing river water. Yes, river water. He told the guard, "Better your ladle than theirs," which sounds weird until you've seen medieval tax law. Then it's poetry. And then there's marriage. Now we won't get scandalous. This is still a bedtime story. But let's just say, not every spouse was a peach. And in medieval Europe, where marriages were often arranged, legally binding, and rarely escapable, a stint in prison could offer an unintentional pause button. Some prisoners were accused of minor crimes and conveniently stayed in custody just long enough to miss a troublesome feast, a difficult in-law's visit, or, yes, even an impending arranged remarriage. One letter from an imprisoned nobleman in Flanders reads, "Tell my cousin that I remain in good health and cannot attend the spring union, as the walls of the court have requested my continued presence." A more elegant way to say, I'm in jail and I'm not mad about it. Historians still argue whether these voluntary stays were deliberate evasions or just fortunate inconveniences. The documentation is often too polite to tell. But context? Context says a lot. Let's also not forget work avoidance. For peasants and serfs, jail time meant time away from forced labor, away from backbreaking farm duties, away from the Lord's corvée, and away from the unending splinter-producing job of chopping wood for someone else's hearth. Sure, the jail floor was cold, but it didn't need plowing, it didn't have fleas, and no one shouted at you for failing to appease the rain gods with sufficient potato output. There's even record of a man in 14th century York who, after finishing his brief sentence, immediately got himself arrested again for shouting at a goose, not threatening the goose, just yelling at it, loudly, on purpose, in front of a city guard. Some say he was mad. Others suggest he really didn't want to return to cleaning chamber pots in the bishop's manor. And can we really blame him? Jail also provided shelter from violence. In many towns, personal vendettas ran hot and long. If someone had it out for you, whether over land, family honor, or the suspicious death of a prized goat, you could find yourself dodging vengeance at every tavern corner. So if the magistrate offers you jail instead of a public punishment, you take it. Gladly, because inside there are witnesses, structure, sleep. One man in Paris reportedly begged to remain imprisoned for the remainder of winter, citing family matters that had become inflamed. The jailer's report simply reads, "Trouble with uncles. Even now, tucked under your blanket, you can feel it, that weird comfort in stillness. The appeal of a place where no one expects you to smile, or pay, or attend the feast where your rival's second cousin will definitely bring up that time with the mutton pie." And while, yes, there were harsh jails, brutal ones, horrors beyond count, we must also acknowledge the gray spaces, where jail wasn't soft, but it was a reprieve, a breathing room, a break, and maybe the most fragile perk of all, obscurity. Outside, your reputation could chase you, your failures, your debts, your family's feuds. Inside, you were just that guy in cell 4 with the sad eyebrows and great handwriting. Sometimes anonymity is worth a cold bench. So when we ask, why didn't they leave? We must also ask, what were they leaving behind? And the answer too often was worse. Worse than soup and straw. Worse than creaky doors. Worse than being the guy who yells at geese on purpose. Sometimes, chains with benefits were better than freedom with expectations. So they stayed and whispered to themselves, "Not today. You're not quite sure how you got here. The floor is smoother now, polished by thousands of patient feet. The light is warmer too, flickering with a golden hush, like it knows it's entering sacred space." You pass a wooden door, just slightly ajar. Inside, candlelight, the scent of myrrh, a quiet someone whispering prayers into the dust. Welcome to the strangest turn in our sleepy journey, miracle prisons. Yes, miracle, and no, that's not sarcasm. In some corners of medieval Europe, prison wasn't just a place of punishment or waiting. It was believed by many to be a place where heaven occasionally made house calls. Let's ease into this gently. It starts, as many strange things do, with saints. In early hagiographies, those dreamy, dramatic biographies of saints written to inspire awe, prisons show up a lot. Saints were jailed, yes, but often those jails became the setting for divine drama. Chains broke, walls crumbled, angels walked in without knocking, and most importantly, people converted. The jailer, the cellmate, occasionally the mouse in the corner, depending on the storyteller's mood. These stories were copied, recopied, and passed from scriptorium to scriptorium, inked in gold leaf, and whispered in chapel by candlelight. But here's the thing. Over time, real prisoners, those not in line for sainthood, began to believe that something about jail itself made a person closer to heaven. More seen, more heard, more likely to be visited or forgiven. So jails, in some regions, took on a strange glow. A cell wasn't just where you waited, it was where you might receive a vision, where God, or one of his multitasking messengers, might pull up a stool. Let's meet Helene. She's not famous, a washerwoman from a sleepy French town, accused of sorcery because her rosemary soap worked too well and her neighbors didn't like her laugh. Thrown into jail, where she sat in the corner of a damp, single-window cell and prayed not to be burned or banished. She said later that on the third night a light filled the room. She heard no voice, saw no face, just warmth, a sudden, inexplicable peace. The guards said she glowed when they brought in her meal. The charges were dropped within the week. Coincidence? Mercy? Storytelling? Hard to say. But her cell became known. A few years later, a nun requested to visit it, then a friar, then a bishop. Eventually, people came to sit where Helene had sat, hoping for visions or peace, or at least a break from yelling vendors at the marketplace. And just like that, the jail cell became a shrine. Historians still argue whether this was a real spiritual movement or a clever way to rebrand inconvenient architecture. But across France, Italy, and parts of the Holy Roman Empire, we find evidence of devotional graffiti. Saint names etched into jail walls, prayers carved beside the door, tiny crosses scratched into the mortar with thumbtacks or bones. Some jails even leaned into the trend. In Cordoba, a small side cell was kept empty for reflection and was said to have healing properties. People would be sent there for 3 days, not as punishment, but to pray for clarity. Some called it the listening room. And there's more. In England, particularly during the rise of Lollard and later Protestant dissent, jails sometimes housed religious thinkers, quiet radicals, scribes, and preachers, with very unpopular thoughts about wine, Latin, and whether popes should own velvet. In those dim rooms, sermons were written, psalms were retranslated, ideas were tested against silence and stone, and sometimes faith deepened. One prisoner in Norwich wrote in his journal, "Here I speak to no man, yet I hear more than I did among 10. Even those not of saintly reputation occasionally claimed strange encounters, visions of departed loved ones, dreams of light, waking to find messages written in frost on the walls, names, symbols, sometimes just a word like stay. Are these dreams? Hunger? Desperation? Maybe, but for someone stuck between judgment and forgetfulness, a dream can be a mercy." Some even said certain cells were lucky, that if you spent a night there, you'd win your trial, or be healed, or, less glamorously, get extra bread for lunch. Let's not overlook the guards. Some jailers claimed that a few cells felt different, warmer, quieter, as if time softened inside them. One famously said, "In there, my lantern stays lit twice as long." Others dismissed it as fantasy, but in a world lit by candlelight and ruled by parchment, mystery held weight. People believed in relics, in sacred springs, in cats that stared too long at empty corners. Why not miraculous jails? Even now, resting in your own quiet room, you can almost imagine it. A narrow cell lit by a single flame, a prisoner curled beneath a cloak, and in the night, a whisper, not from a guard, not from the wind, but from somewhere else. Not every prisoner sought a miracle, but many found meaning. The stillness helped, the structure, the slow stripping away of all but the soul and the walls around it. You can find fragments of that even today, in old cells preserved as museums, in graffiti behind plaster, in that one narrow stone window polished smooth by the hands of hundreds of forgotten people who once rested there and prayed, or waited, or dreamed of something kinder. So why refuse freedom? Maybe because inside something moved, and leaving meant stepping away from whatever that was. Light, silence, mercy, or just the comfort of being for a moment seen. You feel it now? The story circling back on itself like a sleepy cat before settling into the straw. You're deeper into the prison than you've ever been, but it doesn't feel darker, just denser, more layered. The air is thick with time. You can almost hear the echoes of old debates drifting in through the stones, because tonight we're stepping into the strange realm of prisoner politics. Not escape plans, not mutiny, governance, because in the weirder corners of medieval prison life, the people locked inside didn't just survive the system. Sometimes they ran it. It begins with a simple fact. Guards were scarce, overworked, sometimes drunk, and often deeply uninterested in micromanaging a dozen frustrated humans in a windowless box. So what did prisoners do? They started organizing themselves. Meet Joris, a stonecutter in 15th century Ghent. Accused of assault with a broom, long story, he finds himself tossed into a small, overcrowded jail. No staff, no rules, just bodies, boredom, and a bucket. After a week of confusion and poorly assigned sleeping corners, Joris does what any sensible tradesman does. He draws up a list. Who sleeps where? Who gets which chores? Who owes whom a spoon? People grumble, but they go along with it. Soon, Joris is making announcements before dinner, settling minor disputes, mediating squabbles about bread distribution. A prisoner council forms, half real, half a game. They keep minutes. Someone carves them into the wall. The guards, noticing the reduced noise and fewer injuries, shrug and say nothing. Historians still argue whether such self-governance was sanctioned or simply tolerated. But the records don't lie. Power dynamics existed inside prison walls, and some prisoners were better at navigating them than others. These inmate mayors, or cell captains, were often long-termers. People with skills, reading, organizing, or just the kind of charisma that keeps tempers from exploding at stew time. Some were elected informally, others just rose. In one German jail, a prisoner named Albrecht was known as Herr Stille, Mr. Quiet. He didn't talk much, but when he did, so everyone listened. He once convinced two rival gangs to share firewood in exchange for protection from a very mean goat that lived in the hallway. He was respected. Even guards deferred to him when arranging meal times. That goat, by the way, had a name, Margareta. She bit everyone except Herr Stille. Power, it seems, respects power. In some larger prisons, entire internal economies and hierarchies formed. The scribe held prestige. The best cook could barter for silence. The cleanest sleeper was considered good luck. And those with connections to the outside, money, messages, smuggled letters, became de facto nobility. Inmates began enforcing their own rules. Fines for theft, rotating leadership. In one Spanish jail, prisoners held elections for the role of provisions monitor. Candidates made speeches. One promised more dried figs, the other shorter prayers at lights out. The fig guy won. Democracy in action. And while some of this sounds like parody, it wasn't. It was control, dignity, a way to survive, because chaos is exhausting. And humans, even in shackles, crave structure. One London jail had an unofficial quiet hour enforced by two elderly inmates with wooden ladles. If someone spoke above a whisper, they got gently bonked. No exceptions. Even the guards respected the rule, because when prisoners self-regulate, fewer things get set on fire. These micro-societies had laws, not written in books, but spoken, remembered, honored. And they had punishments too. If you broke the code, stole food, snitched to a guard, lied about whose turn it was to sweep, you might find yourself banished to the dampest corner, or fed last, or worst of all, ignored. Silence, in a world of echoing stone, was a sentence all its own. Let's talk about women too. In all-female jails, or women's sections of larger prisons, similar dynamics played out. One record from Rouen describes a woman named Isabeau who became known as the jail mother. She assigned chores, mediated conflicts, and was known for her relentless insistence on twice daily sweeping. When a new prisoner arrived and challenged her, the others formed a circle of silence until she apologized. Community justice, broom included. And then there's the strangest twist, influence beyond the walls. In some cities, long-term prisoners became so organized and so well-connected that they actually influenced local policy. Jails were political hotbeds, full of displaced merchants, scribes, disgraced monks, and former councilmen, people with opinions, and more importantly, time. One jail in Florence sent a petition to the city council asking for improved food quality and suggesting a change in magistrate procedure. It was signed by 30 inmates and co-signed by 2 former judges, currently serving time. The city took it seriously. Why? Because people knew those prisoners weren't fools. They were trapped, not useless. And in many cases, the jail served as a kind of waiting room for fallen players. Not criminals, but casualties of court drama, bad luck, or one too many sips at the wrong feast. The line between inmate and influencer was blurrier than you think. Some even re-entered society with new clout. One former prisoner became a town mediator. Another, a beloved baker whose jail rolls were said to be the softest bread in 5 counties. Maybe it was the extra kneading time. So when we look at prisoners who refuse to leave, consider this. They weren't always staying out of fear. Sometimes they were leading. Inside those walls, they had purpose, position, a voice. Outside, they'd be just another debtor, another peasant, another man yelling about figs in a too crowded market square. But inside, they were captain of Cell 5, mediator of the bread disputes, trusted keeper of the dice. So they stayed, not because the world forgot them, but because in here they were remembered. Here we are, the very end of the hall. The stones are softer now, not literally, but in how they sit with you. Less imposing, familiar, like a worn slipper for your mind. This is the last room in the jail. The end of the story, but not the end of understanding. Because tonight, in this final stretch, we reach the strangest image of all. A jailer leaves the key in the door, and nobody runs. It's not a metaphor. It happened many times, in many towns, for many reasons. Let's dim the torchlight and step into this last mystery together. Why did some medieval prisoners stay, even when the doors were left open? Let's begin with a real moment. Norwich, 1371. A scribe named Roland was imprisoned for forging a land deed. A good one, honestly. His script was excellent. The bishop's clerk missed it on first glance. He was locked in a civic jail with 12 others. He copied petitions, read aloud, sang in a fair baritone that echoed nicely in the stairwell. One night, a fire breaks out across town. The guards rush off. Chaos blooms. The next morning, the magistrate returns to check the damage, and Roland is still there. He's sitting on the floor, playing dice with the mason in cell 2. The door was open. The hinges had groaned for hours. He'd seen the flames, heard the yelling, but he hadn't moved. Why? He simply said, "No one told me I could go." Was it fear? Habit? Passive obedience? Maybe, but it wasn't an isolated incident. In jails across medieval Europe, when accidents happened, guards vanished, or doors were left unlocked. Many prisoners stayed put. Some didn't even notice. Some noticed and didn't care. The reasons were many and deeply human. Routine, for one. When every hour is mapped out, when stew arrives at the same time, prayers echo in the same cadence, and even the dust has a rhythm. Breaking that cycle feels like chaos. And when the world outside feels jagged and uncertain, routine becomes sanctuary. Guilt, too. Some prisoners genuinely believed they deserved to stay. That escape, even if accidental, would taint any chance of absolution. That staying was part of penance, not just to please the court or the clergy, but to clear their own inner ledger. Fear, certainly, because beyond those unlocked doors waited debts, enemies, rejection. Jail might be stone, but it's honest stone. The street could lie, whisper, betray. And then there's something deeper, settling. Not in the sad sense, in the real one. The sense that this place, however flawed, has become yours. You know the sounds here. You know the guard's uneven footsteps. You know which corner of your cot never warms up. You know the exact moment the midday light slants through the bars. You know yourself in this space. And the key in the door? That's not temptation. It's background noise. There's a story from Bruges about a jailer who purposely left the keys in the lock during holidays, claiming it was a test of moral character. He did it for 10 years, Only one person left, and even then, they returned 2 days later. Said they didn't like the noise outside. In Florence, a nobleman spent 5 extra days in prison after being acquitted. He said he wanted to leave on a Wednesday. Why Wednesday? No one knows. He just wasn't ready. Sometimes doors swing open and people stay because the door isn't the problem. The uncertainty beyond it is. And in a world where illness strikes fast, where fire takes whole neighborhoods, where letters go undelivered and alliances collapse at feasts, a jail cell with known shadows can feel safer than freedom with none. So here we are, 15 nights of slow, gentle unraveling. Prisoners who refused to leave, who stayed for soup or order or safety, who made cell walls into family walls, who led councils and bartered for soap, who scribbled poems, prayed for light, slept next to saints or goats or quiet regrets. And when freedom came knocking, they said, "Not yet, not today. I think I'll stay a little longer." And now the last candle flickers. The final page of our scroll has curled ever so slightly at the edges, as if even parchment is sighing with sleep. Outside the jail, our imagined one, full of warmth and whimsy, not cruelty or fear, the world continues. The baker rolls his dough. The market bell tolls once more. The river drifts on, uncaring. But inside, everything is still. You lie there now, in your own kind of cell, not confining but safe. Pillows stacked like friendly walls, blankets pulled up like a silent promise. The fan hums softly overhead, like a jailer too sleepy to rattle his keys. You've wandered through centuries tonight, through shadowed halls and candlelit corners. You've met the quiet rebels, the humble poets, the people who made peace with pause. And maybe, in some small way, you've made peace too. Let the rhythm slow, let the breathing deepen, let the last thoughts drift, not loudly, not insistently, but like feathers caught on dusk. No more arguments, no more questions. Just this, the soft, strange comfort of knowing that sometimes stillness is the bravest thing of all. And sleep is the door you do walk through. No keys, no judgment, no need to explain. Just one quiet step, and you're free.